Hello, hope you can hear me. Kerry Thomas, one of the editors here at Tortoise, and thanks as ever for joining us at today's Open News Thinking. I think you know the drill by now, but for those of you who don't, I think even more than usual, I'm hoping that today we're going to lean on members on the call here to help us understand things, because there's certainly a couple of things we're going to talk about that I really feel I don't fully understand. So it'd be a tremendous help if you can help me and us think our way through them, and we'll come to those shortly. But like I say, the way to join in, two ways really. One is in the chat, and I forget which of my colleagues is doing the chat today. Is it James? It's James. James Wilson, who's in charge of the chat. So please do pile in there. It's always fascinating to see that going on. And we can pull people from there into the conversation in the room as well. And of course, the other way, if you press on the participants tab, you'll see a button under the list of participants that says raise hand, and we would dearly love you to raise your hand and join in on the things that we want to talk about today. I think I've been away for a few days, and I got back yesterday and woke up this morning feeling slightly gloomy about life, if I'm honest, because I was following the news yesterday, the government's announcements about the different lockdown tiers that are going to be in force around England. And it's obvious, I think, that life has got more complicated since those days in March, when we really had one fundamental aim in mind, which was to try to suppress the virus. And sort of traveling through the north of England yesterday on my way back down to London, you could hear these arguments playing out about the way that the north of England, Nottinghamshire, these places feel that they've been overlooked or neglected in the way the government has handled coronavirus. But also, I think you can see the kind of political tensions within the cabinet and between London and the regions playing out very vividly now, and those pressures didn't feel quite so present back in the spring. So we've got this complicated picture. We're clearly not just following the science anymore. Can't say that when the government's own chief medical officer is casting doubt on whether the policy the government is announcing at that moment is going to be sufficient. So we're not following the science. We are trying to balance the risk to public health and the risk to the economy. But I think it's when you see the interventions that Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, seems to have made on the economy. One of the reasons I think I felt gloomy this morning was because you can't help but think that you would only make those kind of interventions if the picture that your forecasters were presenting to you was one of really intense concern about how the economy will be in 2021. So I think 2021 is a thing worth worrying about, and we'll talk about that a bit today, I hope. But when you look around for who's thinking clearly about the economy, then one thing we did hear yesterday was the Bank of England raising this idea about negative interest rates. And that's where I think I'd like to start, partly because I think it's when you look around and say who's thinking in unorthodox and interesting ways about what the economic remedies might be to the situation we're heading into, then at least that sort of move from the bank suggested that at least they're open to things that they've previously not considered. So let's kick off there, because and let's start with, I'm going to bring in my colleague Chris Cook, if I may, because this, as I said, this is one of the things that I am categorically no kind of expert in. Chris may not be either, but he's better at pretending than I am. So Chris, just quickly tell us, just let's walk through this very gently for my benefit here. What did we hear yesterday about what the Bank of England was considering that it hadn't considered before? What was the bank looking for?
So the bank, so in England, the Bank of England can, when it talks about controlling interest rates, what it really means is that it controls one interest rate, And by fixing that one interest rate, it tries to control, if you like, the whole financial system by holding control as one number. And it basically asked, if we pull that number negative, are there going to be any unforeseen circumstances or issues that will arise in banks were we to hypothetically do this at some future point? What are the things we need to be worrying about? I think really from a financial stability perspective that we haven't really thought about that you might have done. So this letter went out to financial institutions. So it's sort of, they're doing the necessary homework they do before they start thinking about negative interest rates. So I think you should think of it as them doing homework, but probably not, doesn't mean it's going to happen in the next month. I think this is indicative of the fact that they're now thinking, when it's a long recession, we're already basically at the zero interest rate bound at the moment. And, you know, the one
okay. Before we go further, Chris, so two things. Firstly, anybody on the call who has real economic expertise, who has something to say about negative interest rates, would you please put your hand up now, because I'll need your help. And secondly, Chris, while we're talking about doing homework, help me with mine here. So let me do my sort of Margaret Thatcher house husband's view of negative interest rates. So generally speaking, if I put my money in the bank in a savings account, then the bank will pay me to have it there. If in my sort of house husband's view of negative interest rates, that situation is flipped, so that I put my money in the bank and they're going to charge me for the privilege of keeping it.
So it's important to understand that the Bank of England fixes one interest rate, so the overnight interest rate, and it's a one very short term period, if you like, of one's a very short, narrow, quite weird interest rate it controls, and then everyone else prices off that. So it's already the case that we have to pay for our mortgages, right? We don't have to at more than bank rate. And similarly, if we go negative, we'll expect that what they're doing is they're moving the whole tail of this whole distribution of prices of interest rates down by controlling this one here. No one is actually able to borrow money for 0% at the moment, except the government, for 0% at the moment. That the number the bank sets, we all have a sort of intuitive understanding. The number the bank sets is like, if you like, a floor on the interest rates that we might end up paying. And similarly, if they go negative, it doesn't mean that we will get paid to save money, that we will pay to save money. What it means is that it means that they're trying the big curve of interest rates, off which we all draw the amount we get for savings, the amount we pay for debt. They're trying to crash it through the sort of the zero barrier, not because they care particularly about the very short-term lending, but because if they can reduce the cost of very short-term lending, they can make it cheaper to do longer-term lending as well. But that will, to you as a consumer, just feel like interest rates continue to be cut.
Okay, but Chris, if I was a bank,
yeah,
and I want to leave money on deposit with the Bank of England overnight, which is something that banks do, then this might have an effect on that arrangement. Yes.
Yes. So one of the complications of this is we don't. So in the Eurozone, they actually have two interest rates. It's getting quite deep into the weeds, but they have two interest rates, and they sometimes talk about them separately, and which are fixed. The two interest rates are like our interest rate, which are discussed by policymakers. They're two levers, right? And we only really talk about one. So it's possible that negative interest rates in the UK will take the form of applying a negative interest rate to an interest rate that we don't really talk about at the moment, like a technical thing to do with deposits held on the reserves with the Bank of England, which is part of how they've done it in Europe. Or it could be they're going to try and do it to what we think of as bank rate, like they're really going to try and sink that number below zero. I say try because they don't have total control over it. They have to sort of try and they have to hold the market in that place. It's quite a how they would actually do it is still a thing we don't really know.
And the point of it, Chris, would be if I was a bank, rather than me depositing money with the Bank of England, would be to incentivize me to put that into the economy rather than keeping it in the bank. Yes.
So if you imagine a world where as a bank I put if I put $100 million into the pounds into the book it with the Bank of England in my reserve account there, and I would expect to get back, let's say it's a high interest year, 110 million normally, I would be less inclined to hold it there. Obviously, if the interest rate were 5% rather than 10%, I'd be still less inclined to hold it there if it were 3% rather than 5%. And similarly, you have to think of this is just the logical next step once you've hit zero, just to think, okay, well, now we start charging. And so the idea is to incentivize people not to hold cash on hand, basically, but to invest it, but to lend it out. To make it easier, to make it profitable to lend at very, very low interest rates.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, don't go away because I'm going to come back to you. But our colleague Tessa has bravely put her hand up. Tessa does know some, quite a lot about this kind of thing. So Tessa, what have Chris and I got wrong so far?
Keep her on mute. Okay. Correct me.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
I think it's important to understand the mechanics by which the banks could do this. I think we do get, as you said, Chris, slightly down in the weeds of that, because the reason I raised it this morning is I'm interested in the way we keep going back to the same levers to pull to solve problems. And we're looking to the same levers in terms of lending, public debt, that we looked to post-credit crisis, but we're looking at old solutions to a new problem. And the reason I think we're talking about this morning was off the back of the infrastructure thinking we had this morning. And no, I haven't, James, I haven't. But I'm interested in, if you take your point, Kerry, about how are we going to support the economy in this, it isn't a brave new world, it's a shitty new world. We're going to have to do some things very differently. And if you look at the government's appetite for borrowing, and you can argue the case whether we should have a more voracious appetite for borrowing or not. We've got capital sitting that needs to be released. And in my mind, it's a bit like relaxing the planning rules. If you want stuff to be built, if you want land to be used more efficiently, you can't let people sit on it. Yeah, so you've got to put disincentives for building up great big land banks. And at the moment, we've got capital banks. We've got a lot of cash sitting in the system that hasn't been deployed effectively. And if you want to sidestep some of the issues about the political aspects or the ideological aspects of lending and public and private and infrastructure funding, yada, 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 if you distribute it, if you get the banks distributing more, then I think you can tackle things on the level that we need it to be tackled, which is at a national level for big projects, but more importantly, for a local level with branch networks to see, these more targeted and geographically appropriate measures coming in place. So I just think we need to unlock a new siphon of funding and I'm interested. I don't know the answer. I don't know if negative interest rates are the right mechanism to do that, but it sure as hell feels like we need to be picking up some new ideas and turning them around. But what I'm interested in is, if we did implement them, what happens then? Does that lead to a massive collapse in the house market because suddenly, debt is even cheaper and prices fall because there's a massive surplus of stock? Does it, what would the actual impacts of this outflow of capital from banks look like? Would it cause inflationary pressures? Don't know. Anyway, those are my questions.
Does it seem to you, because we've had a sort of view from Chris that actually this may not be a sort of new thing. This is just more of the same, that there's been this downward pressure on interest rates for a long time, and this is just further downward pressure that will then trickle through into other. But does it seem to you like more of a departure from where we've been than a sort of continuation of where we've been?
Well, I mean, I do defer to any economist on this call, but we haven't. I don't think we've ever had negative interest rates, and we haven't, have we, Chris? No. We've seen the implementation of negative interest rates in other European countries. I think Switzerland and Sweden, probably, it's always Sweden, isn't it, over the last 7-10 years, and sort of sophisticated economies have adopted this, and I want to know why they have and why we haven't. And I think that taking some of these decisions out of governments hands in terms of where capital is deployed and which businesses and projects are supported. I mean, we had a bit of a ding dong this morning in the thinking, didn't we, about the ability of public sector to deliver big projects effectively. And even Jesse Norman admitting that he'd set up a training course for ministers about how to be a better client, how to ask the right questions in a project environment, which struck me as when he said that he wanted the civil service to be full of people who'd actually had operational experience in life. I thought, well, could we not have a few bloody ministers who've had some operational experience in life too, please? But you know, are we looking at every strata of capital that's available to reboot the economy post-COVID? Are we really examining all of those choices that we've got?
Yeah, Chris, Tessa raised there the fact that countries like Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark as well, I think, have had negative interest rates as part of their armory for a while. Is there any evidence of what has happened in those countries when they've allowed that to happen?
Yeah, so it is sort of more of the same insofar as that it's behaved like, you know, it's a credit expansion in the same way that sort of quantitative easing was another way of thinking about the same problem, another way of thinking about what happens when you hit the lower bound. It's sort of it's a continued expansion, and one of the problems we've got to deal with is that we're quite an unusual country in lots of ways, one of which is in relation to our relationship with money and credit, and each different banking system has a slightly different sort of response function to what happens when you raise or lower interest rates. So there's a thing known as the reversal rate, which is a sort of hypothetical line at which banks become so worried about losing money when interest rates drop far enough that they basically start pulling in their horns in response to lower rates. So there's a point at which banks basically become you sort of lower and lower rates, and all of a sudden they stop expanding lending as you want them to do and start pulling them in. And there is evidence that that is a lower number in the UK than it is in other countries. So we might be better placed to use negative interest rates than other countries. But lots of this stuff is deep into the plumbing. So one of our, I think Sam Houston asked what happens to tracker mortgages. So that's the kind of thing, weird little things like what is the small print on a tracker mortgage is stuff that will have enormous impact on what actually happens to the banks. I think for the most part in Britain, they have a zero bound. They have they're not allowed to go negative, the tracker number. So which will mean that if you, the potential basically for banks to make a bit of money there actually on because they can increase their spreads. Yeah, that little plumbing stuff is what determines like the reversal rate and the response function to dropping these rates, which is why it's quite hard to look at other countries.
Yeah, actually, Sam Houston, if you're out there, let me pull you in because you may not have the answers, but you're asking some very interesting questions in the chat. So I'll come to you in a second. But Chris, in the end, that kind of question, the one you just raised about tracker mortgages, is that in effect what the Bank of England has been doing here? Is just trying to figure out what the small print is on things like tracker mortgages, so they can work the effect through.
Yeah, exactly. And they need to work out whether there's no point lowering or raising interest rates if it's not going to translate through the monetary trans mechanism into real world economic consequences. And that is a thing that sluices directly through banks. And so you need to know what happens in these weird circumstances with the response function of banks. Stuff like their ability to borrow, their sort of particular maturity mismatches, their particular contracts they've written with other people. We may find out that there's a bank, Sam, who has tracker mortgages where interest rates are allowed to go negative, in which case they will have the best mortgages imaginable, but they may also just be starting to lose money in the coming months. We also, one of the things we learned from the financial crisis, by the way, was that we know really clearly you can just take away bank shareholders' money. We can let them burn through their cash and then step in and nationalize them. And actually, that's a thing we can do. So we shouldn't run into the same kind of financial crisis as we had before, because we kind of have a toolkit for that now. We know that you have to keep the bank standing up. You know, they have to keep them lending. And you know that if you can't do that profitably, that's fine, because we will just take over your bank.
Yeah. Sam, are you there? Sam Houston?
Yeah, hi.
Hello. What's just seeing you, like I say, busy in the chat. What's have you been most interested in the kind of consumer end of this, or the sort of macroeconomic picture? What sort of caught your eye about this announcement?
Both really. My last question, the revealing one about tracker mortgages, is because I have a tracker mortgage that is already relatively. Sorry about that. Yeah, I've got a tracker mortgage, so that was my selfish question about myself. I was a little bit concerned as a consumer that if my tracker mortgage gets too low, that my bank will try to put me, my lender will try to put me on a different mortgage, or just generally want to muck about with my mortgage. So thanks for the answer to that, because the answer that Chris gave made most sense to me, in that, yeah, there probably is a zero bound, and if the rate goes lower, and that was really the source of my other questions. Will they go to zero for a bit, see what that does, and then go down in 0.1 increments, or because the kind of mode before was always 25-point adjustments, and yeah, macro, you know, like everybody in the economy, I just want to see, is it going to work? What will it do? I know Chris was not giving financial advice. Thank you.
Yeah, that's at least one thing to be grateful for. Okay, and actually, Andrew Girdwood, if I can just bring you in, because you're coming at this from another point of view, which is really about private equity and where capital resides, I suppose. What have you read? What have you been thinking about private equity in this equation?
Right, so I'm certainly not an expert in this area, but kicking around in the back of my head is this concern that these huge private equity firms, these trust fund managers, have all the money. That's where it's all gone. And it's these companies that are now struggling to find any place to put it, and results in them making some huge bets, which results in companies like WeWork and, you know, unicorns and the like. And I was just wondering how that interplayed with negative interest rates. Certainly, if I was a company and I had the bank of money and I couldn't save it, if I had a vault of money and I couldn't put it in the bank, couldn't make any money, I'd probably be more inclined to put it in with a private equity firm or wealth manager firm. And at the same time, I'm hearing that the wealth managers out there are making more of an effort to go direct to people like you and I, or wealthy individuals, be the next Hargreaves Lansdowne or the next St. James, you know. And I'm sure there must be a relationship here somewhere. If the banking becomes undesirable, people invest privately, surely.
Yeah, I think, Chris, Tessa, let me bring you back in because you got your hand up again.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's a really good point, but I think also we need to remember, just if we put this in the COVID context, where this money will need to go. Yeah, so you'll need, obviously, the big boys investing, but this is why I'm interested to know in how the distribution of this money through the banking system could reach SMEs, you know, the companies that will rebuild a lot of the, you know, the very long tail of small companies that will be suffering the most post-COVID in the economy. You know, PE investment, as we said in the chat, Andrew, you know, it's the cost of borrowing is so low already that yes, it, you know, it will be improved, but we're talking. What I feel the negative interest rate, what I'd like to think the negative interest rate sort of setup would be to, you know, take the handbrake off lending to SMEs through banking. You know, that's what I would really hope it would do, not just sort of, you know, continue to make huge debt finance deals in PE more attractive. And that's what I'm curious to know, if that has been the effect of negative interest rates in other economies.
Yeah, Chris, do you know the answer to that question? What the effect has been?
So that comes back to the sort of problem. We don't really have a financial system. No one's financial system is the same. Actually, our particular financial system is an issue. I also point out that part of what we've got to start thinking about as well is the departure from the EU in the new year, which will be weighing on lots of sort of investment plans. So to Andrew's point about WeWork, the thing is, that's kind of the point, right? So we want the point of lowering an interest rate is that you make it possible to make money on a riskier investment or a lower yielding investment. And when you raise interest rates, you're saying, actually, everyone should back off the more risky, lower yielding investment or lower yielding investments and should stick with safer, more reliable stuff. So in a sense, I mean, WeWork is a catastrophe, but the idea that people should be punting more money into speculative stuff is kind of the idea, because as you say, basically, there's nowhere to put money at the moment, right? You've got to, if people want to make it, they have to sort of put it somewhere. And the idea of cutting interest rates and even cutting them negative is to intensify that force. So we should hope to see more. A sign of policy working will be more terrible, absurd companies getting funded and stupid bets by investors.
I suppose in the end, Chris, the interesting thing is how we should read the call that the Bank of England put out yesterday. Is it in the end, do you think, a sign that because they've traditionally ruled out negative interest rates, is it a sign that they've looked at their sort of in their locker for things that they could do if we get a really severe recession in 2021, and they're thinking to themselves, actually, there's not a lot left there now?
I think there's two things. So that with most public policy stuff on the economy, it's worth remembering that we kind of know everything that almost everyone else knows, right? It's pretty open access. And the Bank of England is the one exception, because the Bank of England has a sort of teams of agents on the ground who literally go around and check the price of oranges on market stalls and do all that sort of stuff. So they are a slightly different sort of institution, and so that's why the criminology is a bit more important with the Bank of England than it was other people. But even so, they're pretty open, and they eventually tell you what they're thinking. What I would, the context for all this is, we know that the labour market is only now starting to show up the signs of the sort of crisis that's unfolding. This morning we got the labour force survey numbers, which were pretty horrific. They're particularly on things like the enormous drops in the number of people in self-employed employment over the last few months.
Chris, what's caused that?
So that partly reflects the fact that we have this weird labour market again. We're a very strange country in lots of ways, that has lots and lots of employment as disguised, lots of precarious employment is disguised as self-employment. And so rather than seeing a rise directly in a fall rather directly in employment, you see a load of the precarious, easy to fire people are actually self-employed. So we're seeing, I mean, it's not literally Deliveroo drivers, but it's people on sort of Deliveroo style contracts no longer being able to work on those sort of things. I would imagine that's that's a big thing. One of the reasons for being self-employed is so that an employer can give you a more precarious job.
Yeah. Okay. Before we move on to something else, if there's anybody on the call who is running a small, medium-sized, large business, I think we're going to try to take a look at the state of the UK economy next week potentially. Any kind of insights, early warnings, stuff that you're seeing? I'd love to hear from you if you've got sort of real world experience of what's coming down the track. While we see whether there's anybody who wants to jump in, let me just come back to you, Chris, because you've been running this sort of Corona shock tracker project for several months now, actually. What's with the benefit of those months behind you, what's it telling you at the moment?
So I think the thing that's really clear, we've not published it all yet, but we've now got 23 weeks of data. And we can see at a ward level how spending is in England and Wales. We've got about 9 weeks of data for Scotland, and we've not been able to get robust data for Northern Ireland. But looking at the England data, which by the way, when we checked against the Scottish data, basically they had the same patterns. We look at English data over those 23 weeks. There are two things that are really striking. The first is you can see Leicester from space, right? You can see there's one place that's different to the rest of the East Midlands. It doesn't recover in line with the rest of the East Midlands. So the lockdowns have severe and sustained effects on spending. So what we are looking at is basically literally the amount of money spent at addresses in towns. So
Leicester is all of us if we're not careful.
Pardon?
Leicester is where we're all going to be if we're not careful in a few months' time.
But I would also, and there's a big thing that's really worrying now, which is about the businesses that basically used up all the fat and then all the resilience, used up all their savings, all their retained earnings, and are now going to be tipped over, if you like, by the next bit of strain. So it may be things are another bit of lockdown is disproportionately much more painful than the last. One of the things that's really clear from this data, from our data, from the spending data, is how successfully businesses were actually able to respond to the lockdown. So before the lockdown processes end, each lockdown process basically is an immediate thump as people have to sort of go home. But then there's a sort of there's a kind of adaptation period where they get back up to, usually 10 or 20% below their normal level, but not 40% down, which is what they were at the very beginning of lockdown. So a they're going to be in this odd period where lockdown might actually be less damaging to spending flows than the previous one, but we'll have a load more fragile businesses that are unable to stand even that lesser hit. The other thing to remember is what we can't see yet, although we will be able to soon, is a sectoral picture that's at the right level. So one of the reasons why that the 20% hit, say, in a town disguises the fact that the hairdresser, say, has had an 80% hit and the grocer is up by 10%. There's been a switch from services to goods. And so there'll be people who think, you know, a lockdown is a disaster for them because it's 100% of their income, even if the aggregate is lower.
Okay. Liz Mosley, can I just pull you out of the chat? Because I'd be interested to hear what your friends' experiences that you were talking about have been. I suppose why it is that people have been able to limp through this far, and you know, through July, August, when we thought things were going to get better, and what it is that sort of tipped people over now.
I think I just noticed it in the last couple of weeks that lots of friends in my, you know, when you're sort of 1 degree of separation, not 2 or 3, so good friends have finally, one's been running a restaurant in Edinburgh for 10 years and they just about squeezed it, and they reopened for takeaway, and then they had a little bit of on trade, and then that's it, they can't do it anymore and the whole thing's gone forever. Happened about a week ago. Quite a number of people who are contractors that I always thought would have work, people who are qualified in project management, have done big tech project delivery in big companies, sometimes working in, you know, the McKinseys and those kinds of organizations, are starting to really struggle. And I think it's a combination of things. Obviously furlough has come to an end and businesses have done the sums and have figured out a plan and are thinking about how they're going to get through the next 12 months. That's part of it. I think part of it is that if you're in a sort of, if you were self-employed, you've run out of savings. Honestly, I think it's why, you know, you sort of figure it when you give up your big job. You figure, I can get myself a bit of a cushion, earnings of maybe 3 months to 6 months, but you never believe that you're not going to get work. That's why people do it. And I think because it's so many people, as I say, 1 degree of separation from me, I'm sure I can't be the only one who's experienced this. So recently, I just feel like when they talk about a tsunami, I can really see it. I can really see it in my, not even in my peripheral vision. I can see it there now. Lots and lots and lots of different people can't make ends meet. I just really can't.
Yeah. Andrew Girdwood, can I just come back to you for a second? Can I use you as our sort of Scottish correspondent for a second? Because I was interested in what Chris was saying about you can see Leicester from space. You can see how different it is from the rest of the country, because it went into a local lockdown that we thought was, or they said was going to be temporary, and it's turned out to be, I think, well over 100 days already. Nicola Sturgeon announced a sort of fairly tough lockdown across the central belt, at least of Scotland, less than a week ago. Are people beginning to see any effect from that, any economic fallout yet?
I think the shine is definitely coming off Sturgeon a little bit up here. In part, that's because of salmon allegations, but it is due to this the second lockdown. Hospital, I think we've done better than North of England because there was less uncertainty. I've not seen the same negativity as I'm seeing from Liverpool, but it certainly hasn't been well received in comparison to the first lockdown. I think. And
Andrew, has it prompted businesses to say, "All right, we've made it this far, but we can't go on any further"? Have you seen that sort of, you know, a fresh wave of people toppling over?
The steady trickle has continued.
All right. Okay. All right. Thanks for that, Chris. We'll move on to something else in a second. But if we do press ahead and try to do something next week on the sort of UK economic picture, given what your tracker is telling you, given whatever else you're seeing, what would your sort of starting point be for what 2021 is going to look like economically in the UK?
So I think everything depends on the capacity to fight the virus. Or everything else is a function of that. So so it's the same question as how will we do at building a track and trace infrastructure? Like, probably not well. And when will the vaccine arrive? And how effective will the vaccine be? it's completely possible that if there's a, you can, like the positive scenario is, you know what, we've had these teething troubles, but now we have a test and trace system and it's being knitted into local government and it'll work better, so that once this period, which can only be dealt with through locking down, is dealt with, we will be within the capacity of the test and trace structure. And then from there, we'll get like a 70% effective vaccine, and then maybe another 40% or 50% effective vaccine a few months down the line after that. And by the middle of next year, we're kind of okay again. And in that scenario, if every other major country is going through the same sort of timeline, then you can see enormously fast rebounds in the middle of next year. Conversely, if we are a laggard on any of that stuff, I think one of the things is underpriced is the capacity of the vaccine to only be very partially effective. It's possible that, for example, a vaccine is deemed effective at 50% efficacy, which is to say that maybe that half of the country doesn't get a proper immune response and remains vulnerable to it. That 50% may be people who are somehow more immunologically vulnerable to it. They may have characteristics that make them more vulnerable. It's possible that we'll need to have several rounds and several goes. It's possible that there are real nightmares, like what if the virus drifts and we have to make a new vaccine at some point because it turns out there's a new strain of it emerging? All of these things we normally worry about with flu, which are quite low stakes, are suddenly quite high stakes. We think a good flu vaccine, but we had a real problem with the flu vaccine about 3-4 years ago, because it was only about 1 in 3 effective, which is why we had a high flu toll a few years ago, because it so happens that it had drifted, it mutated away from the precise form for which we had a vaccine. There are real nightmares that we could have. This could go on for a while. Sorry to be downbeat.
All right, let's not have nightmares yet. Okay, I think we're living in a world, I think, where there are really 2 hugely dominant stories. So COVID and the economy is one, and the other one at the moment is the US election. So worth, I think, spending a bit of time just tucking into the US election. Charles Wittelli, you out there? There you are.
Yeah.
James Harding, our boss, sent us some homework this morning, a long thing to read from a thing called the Transition Integrity Project, which was concerned about the handover, if there should be one, from Donald Trump to Joe Biden, which is something you've been writing about in SenseMaker. And one of the sort of key points that Transition Integrity Project document made was that the concept of election night is flawed and arguably dangerous. That in fact, we should think about an election period that goes on from the middle of September, possibly right up until January the 20th, when there has to be a new president. Just talk us through what you think is worth kind of thinking about, Giles, if we think about that election period.
Yeah. It's important probably not to get hysterically worried at the start. I remember when we had a summit recently on global leadership, sort of co-hosted by Ivo Dolder of the Chicago Council on World Affairs. He said, as a very well sort of plugged in Democrat in the middle of the country in Chicago, that he broadly thought if there was a 10-point Biden lead on the day in the popular vote, that would be sufficient to feed into, very broadly, enough electoral college votes for a result that Trump could not ignore, could not accept on the night. Of course, there are any number of wrinkles and pathways to this and that under that. But the only reason I mention that is that looking at the polls now, there is a perfectly reasonable possibility of that kind of a margin on the night and a result on the night. But the nightmare that the Transition Integrity Project and many others have been thinking about, so it goes like this, and this is what leads us into having to deal with a a period rather than a night, and really requires people of all political persuasions to be prepared rather than unprepared. And that is a bipartisan project, by the way, important to note. The nightmare is basically that Trump wins Florida on the night. Florida counts, will report its result on the night. And then say 3 of the blue wall states that Trump flipped in 2016 are close enough for him to contest.
Which states would those be, Giles? Just for amateurs like me?
I think it's worth, they'd probably be Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which between them represent 46 electoral college votes. I should say that at the moment, they are in the real clear politics rolling average of polls has Biden ahead there by 6.3, 7 and 7.3 points respectively. In a normal cycle, people might think this was all done and dusted, but we've been stung by that. Everyone, pollsters and voters alike in 2016. So there's an acceptance now that we're not living in normal political times. Anything can happen. But what could happen in the event that Trump wins in Florida, contests those states, does not accept the result on the night? Well, just to give you a flavor of that document, I'm reading from my phone here. We assess, the project says, that there is a chance the president will attempt to convince legislatures and or governors to take actions, including illegal actions, to defy the popular vote. I'll come back to that in a second. Participants in our exercise of all backgrounds and ideologies believed that Trump would prioritize personal gain and self-protection over ensuring an orderly administrative handoff to his successor. Trump may use pardons to thwart future criminal prosecution, arrange business deals with foreign governments that benefit him financially, attempt to bribe and silence associates, declassify sensitive documents, and attempt to divert federal funds to his own businesses. And then crucially, in the preceding paragraph, it says, federal laws provide little guidance for how Congress should resolve irregularities when they convene in a joint session, as they would be constitutionally required to do anyway on January 6, 2021. Of particular concern is how the military would respond in the context of uncertain election results, because remember, of course, that the president is commander-in-chief. So that is just a flavor. That's from the executive summary. There are a lot of people getting really worried about a very high degree of chaos. And interestingly, that document refers back to 1876 as the closest analogy. The states in play there that the Democrats were refusing to concede on behalf of Samuel Tilden were Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. But I mean, very briefly, I think it's worth noting, yes, that actually, as it stands, Biden is substantially ahead in those blue wall states. Florida will make an announcement. If Biden wins Florida, he's home free. There is almost no path to victory on the night or later for Trump if he doesn't win Florida. So where are we in Florida? Well, again, I stick with the Real Clear Politics rolling average of polls, because it is there is no liberal wishful thinking on that particular site. He's 3.5 points ahead, which is really within any margin of error. He's also marginally ahead in Ohio, which Trump took by 8 points.
Guys, let me just jump in for a second, because and let me just give fair warning. Matt D'Ancona and Merope Mills, I can see you out there, and I'm gonna pull you in a second, so don't be too relaxed. Giles, the threshold that Ivo Dolder put, 10-point national lead, that as you say, it's not impossible, but it would be fairly extraordinary if the Biden lead held at that level. Without that, Yeah, I think you've been reading stuff as well about the possibility of a sort of concerted legal action in more than, it was bad enough in Florida 20 years ago, but if you replicated that across a number of states, we might be in really quite interesting, difficult territory, mightn't we?
Yes, I mean the lesson of Florida 2000 is that if something can get complicated, get appealed and reappealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, it will be. If it's close, it will be messy, and yeah, we could face a Florida. Can you still hear me? By the way, my saying that my connection is unstable. Can you hear me all right?
Not too. I can hear you fine. It's not too bad.
We could have we could have Florida in 6 or 8 states, and it's worth noting that there's a huge amount of election-related litigation already underway in connection with postal ballots.
All right, I spoke too soon. I spoke too soon. You've collapsed. Let me.
Some of which is
already. All right, Giles, we'll come back to you because your connection is a bit dodgy. Matt, Matt D'Ancona, can I bring you in? Because it does seem to me that a lot of this rests on a kind of idea of Trump as a bogeyman, that his unpredictability, the chaos that he sows around him, that the possibility of him doing almost anything to cling on to power underpins a lot of the concern about that transition, understandably. But there is another Trump as well, which is the Trump that's interested in making money, the Trump that I suspect certainly wouldn't want to go to jail for any kind of election misdemeanors. How do you you talk to a lot of people over there. How do you think which of those Trumps in the end is going to be the stronger character during that period, do you think?
Well, it's a really good way of looking at it, actually, because I mean, one thing we've learned since he fell ill, and now of course he's tested negative, so he is technically better, although the after effects of the illness, as we know, are considerable, is that he thinks he's going to live forever, and therefore he'll be thinking of if not the long game, then certainly the after game. Now, if you can think back, it's not that long ago, but it seems a long time ago, to his presidential debate with Biden. This was a man who was preparing for defeat. He said things like, "This is not going to end well," and the notorious stand back and stand by guidance to the white supremacist militias and so on. Now, I always feel with Trump that one of the great errors that people have made is not to take him seriously and not to take him literally. At the beginning of the whole Trump phenomenon, we were advised not to take him literally, but to take him seriously. You have to do both, I think. So it certainly seems to me that given his position on postal ballots, given his clear he's declared intention to go to the Supreme Court. I mean, he said that in the debate. His declared intent to not to observe the official results until he's had a good look at it, and the very dangerous noises he's made about militia groups. We have to take the chaos scenario seriously. I think, though, to pick up on what Giles was saying, I think that there are different circumstances in which that might or might not be an option. And I think I would agree with Giles that I think if Florida is clearly won by Biden, even Trump won't press it. But if let's say there are narrow victories of Biden in the Rust Belt and the industrial Midwest, who knows? But you do make a really good point, Kerry, which is that never forget that the original ambition of this campaign was to set up of the Trump campaign in 2015, 2016, was to set up a television station. It was to set up a media company and to leverage his new political prominence into a television channel. and a global television presence. Now, much to his surprise, as is well described in Michael Wolff's first book, Fire and Fury, they won. And so that plan has been on ice for 4 years. But I agree with you. I think he will want to do, I think, is, I mean, Trump's not really interested in institutions or in even parties. I mean, he's no real interest in the Republican Party. He's interested in power in all its forms. And I think the distinction between media power and political power in his head is very blurred. So there will be part of him that will be thinking, okay, you know, I can see a future where I'm not in the Oval Office, but I actually build some sort of new media infrastructure that really does change the way America works. And whether that's possible, given that America already has quite a successful right-wing television channel in Fox, I don't know. But I'm sure he'd give it a good go. And, you know, given that a Biden-Harris administration will be facing huge problems, the pandemic, economic recovery, trying to jumpstart its climate emergency package and so on, you can immediately imagine a sort of Trumpite resistance movement that had all sorts of fronts, you know, social media, street level, television, and so on, being a very, very formidable force in years to come, and not necessarily even with Trump as the key figure, as he will eventually, one assumes, start to wane as a central force. But I'm sure we haven't heard the last of him. I think there's a sort of narrative in all of this, which is that it's kind of, I call it the Wizard of Oz narrative. You know, there's a kind of ding dong, the Wicked Witch is dead, with all the munchkins running around. That once and if Trump is defeated on November the 3rd, the problem is over. But it won't be. Politics that Trump appealed to is still very much clear and present, and will be whatever happens in the election.
Yeah. Okay. I might come back to you, Matt, but let me jump to Merope if she's found her charger. The world's worst excuse. Merope, are you there? Hello.
I have my charger. It was
hallelujah. Well done.
I just want to say that I want to draw attention to the fact that Matt, who has always had the best backdrop, now has an artful little cat placed over his shoulder just to make it even better. I felt like the cat needed to go commented on. Beautiful, okay. Beautiful thing what you've done there.
Thank you for that. But what I wanted to ask you was, so before you worked for Tortoise, you lived on the West Coast, in the most sort of liberal and progressive enclave on the planet. I'm interested in sort of this vision of Trump and what people assume of him and what people think he's capable of. When you talk to your friends over there, are they still assuming the worst about him, that actually he would be capable of almost sort of any self-interested, repellent kind of maneuver post-election? Or I see Matt has brought the cat into prominent view now for those who want to zoom in. But what are you hearing, Merope, from the sort of West Coast?
So there's what I lived in a little bubble, and everyone in that little bubble was surprised and shocked. Although Matt asked me about this last week, and one of my big memories is that actually even in my little bubble of liberal people in the Bay Area, after the election, signs for Trump were put up after the election where people felt that they could come out and say, actually, I voted Trump. And it seemed to be sort of people realized they weren't the only one. But I've been sort of wondering, generally speaking, Matt mentioned people were told not to take him seriously, but not literally. And that was a quote from Peter Thiel, who was a tech supremo in the Bay Area, who supported Trump financially, spoke at the Republican Party, and And I've actually been quite interested in where he's been on this, because immediately afterwards I expected him to change his mind. He didn't. But actually, I think he has, whilst his company has been helping the government track coronavirus in America, he has not financially supported Trump this time. He was sort of libertarian. He was one of those big Silicon Valley voices who came out for him. Everyone was surprised. And you sort of think if those sort of libertarians, apparently disappointed in the way that he's handled the coronavirus, have now switched allegiance, that is going to mean something, because actually there was quite a lot of support for Trump in California in the end, not next to the coast, but inland farming, that sort of area. So California is a complicated place, but it's always going to be Democrat, obviously. But I think last time there was so much dislike of Hillary. You don't have that. Biden's not a strong candidate, but you don't have someone who people actively seem to dislike. So I don't know, that's really what I'm hearing. They don't, obviously my friends don't want Trump. That's not going to surprise you, is it, Kerry?
No, right, okay. No, but let me just jump back to you, Matt, because I guess if you're looking for consolations for Donald Trump, then the New York Times has been doing some reporting this week about some of the sort of tax maneuvers that he's been able to pull while he's been in office, which have yielded quite significant millions to the Trump financial empire. One way or another, whether it's through the media empire that you sort of envisaged or in some other way, he must surely be thinking, I'm going to make a tremendous amount of money post-presidency, whatever happens here.
Yes, absolutely. And remember, this is someone who has absolutely no ethical restraints in terms of whom he does business with, where he does business, where new Trump towers are set up. There are a whole, one can only imagine. I mean, we know that the origins of the one of the, when you go back to all the original James Comey problems investigating Trump's links with Russia, one of the things that was clear was that Trump wanted to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. So I'm not saying he will do that specific thing, but it's certainly the case that he will endeavour to make a huge amount of money. It's also true that he will probably face more lawsuits than any former president ever. But he's a very successful litigant, Trump. He comes from the school of Roy Cohn, now departed, who was one of Joe McCarthy's counsels and a great sort of very right-wing attorney to the glitterati Studio 54 in the 70s and 80s, and Trump is a very aggressive litigant. So although I'm sure there will be lots of attempts to come after him, and maybe they'll succeed, I think the kind of expectation that within kind of 6 months of leaving office he'll be in Rikers Island, I wouldn't bet on.
No. Okay. Look, in the minute we've got left, Giles, can I just come back to you and see if your internet connection has improved? Because there's one practical thing that I don't know the answer to that you might be able to help with, which is, what's the sequence of counting ballots in a place like Florida, let's say? So that the sort of anti-post assumption is that postal ballots will be used more by Democrats than Republicans, and that in-person voting might be more Republican than Democrat. In somewhere like Florida, do they count all of those things at the same time, or do they count the physical votes first and the postal votes later? How does that work?
I honestly don't know. All I know is that Florida prides itself on delivering a result on the night, and that Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are among the states that don't start counting postal votes until election day. So rather than speculate, I should know. I think what that means is that Florida and other states, including Ohio, start counting postal votes early. But you're obviously right on the earlier point that it is assumed that there is a read across from those who take COVID more seriously to those who are postal voting because of it. And those are Democrats.
Okay, listen, let me say thank you to everyone and just wrap this up. I mean, I think we will certainly try to turn our attention very seriously to the UK economy next week. And there's quite a lot, I think, that we can take from the conversation we've had today. I was really interested, Chris, in what you were saying about the visibility of Leicester from outer space. I think the effect of a local lockdown there, without the supporting measures that allow people to self-isolate and take care of themselves properly, that have been so much argued over in the last few days, something we might look at particularly. But I do think in the bigger picture is that the level of concern about what the economy will be like in 2021 seems to me to be growing and worthy of a look. So we'll, I think, want to tuck into that next week, and we'll certainly return to the US election. And we've got a piece coming about the evangelical influence on the election, which should be fascinating. But alongside that, I think some further thinking about the complexity of that transition period, and that idea that the election period should probably be seen from September through to nearly the end of January, is something again that we will take a fresh look at. So thank you all for coming. Great to see you again, and we hope to see you very soon. Bye for now.